Hello. I'd like to take a look at a topic that I'm going to call how many leading experts have Ph.D. or M.D. degrees from Diploma Mills. Now, if a person were to take a look on YouTube, for instance, and look up Diploma Mills, I think we'd find a number of videos, and they might address topics like certain schools coming out with degrees, credentials, and these schools are not what you might call brick-and-mortar schools, but conducted largely or completely over the internet or through mail order. Or perhaps there's a question of whether these schools are, quote, fully accredited, or who is accrediting them. Is it a major accrediting organization or a minor one, perhaps? But I'd like to take a kind of an overview look here and take an even bigger picture view of what we mean perhaps by a diploma mill, and who too is qualified to even say what a diploma mill is or isn't, and who's the expert and the final word on what accrediting agencies are the best or valid even in the overall perspective. So for instance, if you were to consider that we hear oftentimes that so-and-so is an expert in their field, and the next sentence might be that they obtained their Ph.D. or M.D. degree from so-and-so, or that they simply have a Ph.D. or M.D. degree, and it's assumed it is not from a mail order organization. Well, my next question then would be, what does this mean then? For instance, to say that someone has a college degree and it is not by mail order does not mean that we've differentiated whether it came from Appalachia in the United States or whether it came from Oxford University or Cambridge University in England or Harvard or MIT or Caltech and a few other colleges, Princeton for instance, just to name a few that come off the top of my head. So simply to say someone has a college degree, or even a college degree that produces a Ph.D. or M.D. credential, or we might say license to practice, well, perhaps we ought to take a look where this degree or credential or license is coming from before we just leap off the deep end and say they're the experts and those who have no degree at all are not an expert. Now this also can involve questions too of whether somebody with a degree, so to speak, and I'm particularly addressing Ph.D. and master's degrees to a smaller level, but medical degrees too, whether these expert status degree holders across the board necessarily have training in two key components that I'd like to bring up right now. First, how much training do they have in what I call morals? And in a bigger perspective yet, empathy. For, let's say, if we're trained to be a lawyer, let's say, it would be said that lawyers are required to follow a code of ethics, and the same with doctors. They're supposed to call or follow a code of ethics that says, first do no harm. So, both professions then saying that part of their training was ethical training, or morals training, or, as I would put it on a higher level, ethical, or rather empathy training. But how much training did they really receive? And how efficacious was it really? And secondly, I would bring up the topic of whether many programs, shall we say, and that are then often accredited, are requiring much in the way of mathematics. And I mean more requiring than just one or two calculus courses. For I would throw out a question of whether perhaps every person with a Ph.D. in the liberal arts or every medical doctor ought to also have as training, before receiving any degree at that level, the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in mathematics. And I don't just mean being able to crunch the numbers in algorithmic fashion like a calculator, but really an in-depth ability to look at things from a mathematical perspective. So you might say then, these two factors, I think, get short shrift in most people who receive PhDs or MD degrees in either the soft sciences or liberal arts, such that we can find people in the, quote, caring professions who have studied a lot of liberal arts but have basically no mathematical training. When we talk of training in more than just a few math courses, even if they were calculus or statistics. Of course, too, there are some who would say that even math can be used in a negative direction, and hence the book on the market, How to Lie with Statistics. But still, I think there is a lot of short shrift when it comes to training in morals, or shall we say empathy, and mathematics. And I'll go a little bit more into depth here as time goes on in this episode. But before forgetting, I would mention too that my impression is from life that simply receiving training doesn't mean it really had much impact, especially if we studied it simply to get a good grade and were rushing through the process, versus really letting it soak in, which perhaps is quite difficult to do in a college setting for a variety of reasons. Now, I will bring up then at this point an interesting thing concerning the, quote, helping profession of therapy. Before, let's say, 30 years ago, some people would want to approach emotional troubles by, if not seeing a pastor for counseling, they might want to talk with a therapist or an analyst. Of course, an analyst would cost a lot of money and require a great deal of time, and you'd have to live in the right part of the country too and not move around much. But at one time, analysis or psychoanalysis, call it depth therapy if you will, was an acceptable alternative for certain people. I might add certain people who could handle the pressure of in-depth looks at troubling things that might pop up, not just a superficial look. But then the question is, as time went on, for a variety of reasons, one question is, how scientific is psychoanalysis? And of course, Freud was in many circles greatly discredited for a number of reasons. But of course, we've all heard the phrase, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think if anyone were to attempt some time at psychoanalysis or take a good look at it, they would find it has many good ideas. But I'm not just talking psychoanalysis per se in Freud's sense, but moreover an in-depth view of anything in general. Depth therapy, as opposed to a very superficial 10-session cognitive behavioral therapy view, followed by drug therapy for life. Now, as one practitioner told me once, psychoanalysis and depth therapy in general are unscientific, that the conjectures put out are unprovable, and so basically we shouldn't waste much time and move on to practitioners and teachers who are telling us things that can be verified or provable, let's say by double-blind tests or test tubes studies. But this is a very interesting question then. And furthermore then, I see a kind of interesting phenomenon here, if you will, about the training then of helping professionals in the emotional area. What constitutes proper training? Who got the proper training then that gets vetted with the credentials of a psychiatrist or psychologist at the Ph.D. or M.D. level? The psychoanalyst school said that it wasn't enough to get even a medical degree to practice in the emotional field, that you were required to have a personal psychoanalysis yourself before you could, quote, hang a shingle and help anyone else emotionally, and that this would take probably a minimum of 5 years of personal psychoanalysis at an institute before you got your degree as an analyst, not just a medical doctor or PhD level practitioner. Now, there were a very few number of analysts at one time who didn't have a degree in psychology at all, but then did have a degree in general and went on to analysis at an institute. There was one man, for instance, who graduated from Harvard with a PhD in Sanskrit, who then went to Canada and attended an institute of psychoanalysis there, and eventually obtained a psychoanalytic degree, and was vetted to offer emotional services, if you will. But the whole question being then, was a, quote, personal analysis required or not to be qualified to offer services in the emotional realm? So, if we take a bigger look yet, then, who gets to say who is qualified to practice in the emotional realm at all? Is it the person with the analytic experience, personal analysis, or is it the person who simply went to classes and got good grades and passed certain exams and maybe wrote a paper called a dissertation? Again, is training in morals, empathy required to an in-depth nature? And how much mathematics, again, is required? How good of a thinker, beyond a rudimentary level, beyond the capacity to memorize, is required? Those colleges who put out degrees with no empathy training to an in-depth nature, and no degree necessary, no in-depth training in mathematics, are these bona fide colleges at all, or are they diploma mills? Thus, the psychoanalysis approach, the analyst might say that those in the helping field who have not had a depth therapy training as part of the package have obtained a helping degree from a diploma mill. Of course, this can be translated too then to the field of religion. For instance, who gets to say who is a well-qualified minister or preacher? Is it the one with a Ph.D., or is it the person from Appalachia who preaches in a small church, say, and calls himself brother so-and-so, and perhaps never went to any college at all, except maybe the college of the School of Hard Knocks, whereby he might say he has a Ph.D. from the finest institution in the world, at a Ph.D. level in the School of Hard Knocks. But then to carry it even further, who gets to say who is more qualified to discuss life issues, philosophical issues and emotional issues, and values? Is it the person who obtained a Ph.D. from Harvard even in theology, but is then discredited, perhaps completely by some, because what they say from a theological perspective is totally unprovable from a test tube experiment or double-blind study? Or is it the person who is great at some mathematical or scientific discipline that could be said to offer knowledge from a test tube perspective or double-blind perspective, and thus is creditable because these people have, quote, scientific knowledge. It's supposedly verifiable. But then I would throw out a larger order question. How many double-blind studies, how many test tube studies have been done on the whole concept of double-blind studies? So that would be an interesting question. At this point, I would bring up a couple anecdotes or personal experiences to flesh this out a bit. For instance, I don't talk about this very much at all, if ever, but I obtained a, quote, degree from a service academy, and in this case, West Point. But for a variety of reasons, I tend not to regard West Point as a college. And furthermore, even if I were to call it a college I graduated from, it is not something that I get much credit for if someone wants to refer to so-and-so as an expert and me not, because so-and-so has a Ph.D. or M.D. degree, whereas I have this, quote, bachelor's degree. Well, I would bring up some interesting points. For instance, consider that while I did go to West Point, and thus supposedly had a lot of training in character, the phrase being duty, honor, country drilled into our heads there. Character, honor. I would point out something very interesting, almost a bit comical perhaps, that there was this topic once in my third year there. I would say, first of all, not the first year or the first month, but the third year in a military history or military instruction course. The topic was, what is a just or unjust war? And while that might have been the most important question to address at all, and very early on, it didn't come till the third year. And very interestingly, this topic was covered for a grand total of 15 minutes. And the verdict was less than satisfying, shall we say. In fact, I think the unstated tacit conclusion was that the whole question of whether we were going to be fighting a just or unjust war someday was to be settled by simply listening to our leaders or our government officials in general. Of course, are not having much time to even examine that in the day-to-day life. But at any rate, the whole concept being that supposedly we were getting fine instruction in moral character, duty, honor, country, and so on, and the whole institution looked gleaming, spotless, squeaky clean. But again, simply because we had the degree and the code of conduct didn't necessarily mean we were well trained in general. And that's what I'm getting at here, perhaps, that simply because we, quote, got training in our specialty or part of something that was important for our specialty, it didn't really mean that we were as trained as we were claimed to be. Now, the next example I would bring up is of an incident I experienced once when I was working in the medical profession. Now, I would also add that I went into the military service, West Point, in this case, with the express purpose to become a medical doctor, so I had always had an interest in medicine. But my grades weren't good enough, and so I had to shelve that idea. But at any rate, way later in time, I took up a position in the healthcare field for a brief time. And I was once working as an aide in an Alzheimer's hospital. And if I remember correctly, and I believe I do, the patient there, who was designated as having the beginnings or more of Alzheimer's, and who had just been brought there 12 hours beforehand, had been brought a meal which went uneaten. And frankly, I think I would not have much joy in eating it either, if I were even in a very good mood and of a very good mindset in every which way. If I remember, the potatoes, for instance, were in a brisket form and probably as hard as a rock. And who knows how tasty and full of grease. But the upshot is that he was supposed to be happy while he was eating it, and of course eat the whole thing, and be blamed for poor health if he didn't. Why? Precisely and exactly because it was designed by someone with a degree, and not your grandmother, and not your mother, and not anyone else, but someone who was an expert in designing food. This brisket had been designed by someone probably with a master's degree, but hey, we might as well say in some instances a Ph.D. or medical degree, from an approved, vetted institution with double-blind test tube studies backing up that this brisket was not only tasty and edible, but best for his health, versus what your grandmother might provide you or your mother, which frankly he probably would have gobbled down in 2 seconds. But this brisket, which was basically unappealing to the eye and inedible, and thus not eaten, of course, was designed by an expert. It had, by the way, been studied in detail as to its chemical composition, and it was balanced, and of course subject to test tube studies and double-blind studies. So who was the patient or anyone else to question the expert? At any rate, I would have shuddered to go visit him a week later or a month later, to discover perhaps, let's say, 10 or 20 briskets stuffed in the corner, if nobody had taken them out of the room for whatever reasons, and that this man was totally emaciated and near death, or in fact dead, because he would not eat these scientifically designed, double-blind studied and test tube studied briskets from a, quote, trained expert at the master's degree or Ph.D. or M.D. level, as opposed to a mother or grandmother having brought him tasty, delicious scrambled eggs or anything else that was his favorite. We might even say steak and egg dinners, served back up in Texas on a ranch somewhere. Please try serving a brisket designed by a trained expert from a college to a rancher in Texas before he goes out to the fields for a hard day's work. I think you might find him raising a few eyebrows on this. In fact, before I forget, this brings up the image of Ronald Reagan and his love of horses and ranches. And at one point in time when he was talking of something regarding Soviets, he said, "Trust but verify." So perhaps I might say, before I forget, perhaps we ought to do trust in a sense of experts with certain degrees, but also verify in our own mind. And I say this with not a hint of anger or malice, but humor. Finally, as a third example, I would bring up how someone who is a family member of mine once told me that my West Point degree was of little value because most of the instructors there had, quote, only a master's degree and not a Ph.D. Level training like this family member had himself. But then the question is then, what constitutes better training in an overall sense? Was it the, quote, instructor with that master's degree, but who had attained that master's degree only 5 years minimum after their bachelor's degree and after having had as a minimum a company command and often perhaps, or sometimes, battlefield training. And that company command, by the way, having involved management in various degrees of at least, say 75 or 100 men, or men and women. So then, what constitutes better training? A degree at a master's degree level, studied, by the way, at age 28 and not 22, and a lot of business experience, military experience, even battlefield experience, or is it the, quote, Ph.D. or M.D. Individual who simply went to class and passed tests and got that degree after paying their tuition? And then I can't help but bring up a fourth example here of how Native American Indians had elders who would have powwows, or maybe that's not the right word, but they would sit in lodges or around fires and have discussions on a variety of things with younger people. They were venerated. But I suppose in today's milieu, they would not be considered, quote, experts because they don't have a Ph.D. or M.D. degree. Which then brings up the question of what is the word wisdom all about? And perhaps many people today would then have to say there is no such thing as wisdom at all, because wisdom doesn't come from a college. There's no class in wisdom, so perhaps wisdom doesn't exist. Just as perhaps love doesn't exist either, because love isn't testable from a double-blind study or test tube study, and except for Leo Biscaglia, back in the 80s at the University of Southern California, having taught Love 101 at the college level, there was probably never again in the entire world's history a course on love. So, for the express reason that love is not testable with a double-blind study. But then, of course, that would chuck out the window the whole concept of empathy, love, wisdom, and finally, intuition. For intuition, too, is untestable in a double-blind study or test tube. And yet, without it, who would we be at all? We need logic plus intuition, don't we? Or, as some people would say, gut feelings. But gut feelings are not testable, so to speak. So who is the expert then? Is it the person who has the degree and says they're the expert because their degree has scientific backing? Well, this is a very interesting and important question, isn't it? Finally, yet another example. My mother, who has a high school degree and immigrated to this country at age 12 from Eastern Europe, or at least she was born in Eastern Europe. Well, is she a trained expert or not? For instance, one of her jobs she held was to help young children with emotional difficulties or learning difficulties. Well, perhaps we would call it learning difficulties in the classroom, but they had an emotional basis, typically. Well, her pay rate, which was $2 an hour at the time, her pay rate was based on her not being a trained expert in the emotional field. So she received the grand total of $2 an hour. On the other hand, the teachers, so to speak teachers, with degrees, nowadays probably at least a master's degree, received pay that was far greater per hour, if you will, or salaried, because they were the trained experts, but she wasn't. But interestingly, my mother was once perhaps one of the few people who could get through to these children. Probably most all trained expert teachers couldn't, and probably wouldn't waste their time trying even. They would probably just write off the children as having some, quote, mental disorder, and have them either given the standard fare these days of certain drug therapies called medications, or perhaps they might be shipped off to an institution. So, this is an interesting question, of course, in many, many ways. Who gets to be called an expert and who doesn't? And who gets to be paid a living wage? And who doesn't, on the basis of who is a, quote, trained expert and who isn't? And finally, who gets to decide who is a trained expert at all? And this is the whole point then of this topic I'm bringing up. Is someone a trained expert just because they have a college degree, or not, and the upshot being, is this degree from a diploma mill or not? For if all degrees are the same, this needs a little more investigating, I think. Now, at this time, I would bring up the facetious comment, perhaps, of some who might say they have a Ph.D. from the School of Hard Knocks, but it isn't printed up and hanging on a wall in a $200 frame. But nevertheless, they're saying they ought to have a degree that says they have a Ph.D. or medical degree on the basis of their experience. Also, who is to say or not say whether, quote, clinical experience, say so-and-so saying they have 20 years clinical experience, is that good experience or not? I would ask. Let's say, too, what if someone has attended a number of years of college, but, quote, became a dropout and never had a degree accorded them? For instance, I rarely talk about this topic, too, but when I was, 41, I believe, I went to a community and took 2 classes a semester for 4 years in mathematics. And because I was not a, quote, regular student, and wasn't paying tuition per se, but in part paying for the classes by working 10 hours a week for this school as partial remuneration for my taking the classes in the first place, I never received a degree after 4 years' study there. It could be argued, of course, I didn't acquire enough class time at that pace, but at any rate, I did study a gargantuan number of math classes, but I have no degree to show it. Well, then what about people who have studied so much of anything, including life experience and all their observations and ponderings and discussions, but don't have either classroom vetting or a degree to show for it? Yet another example. At that same point, at age 41, I discovered a software program in accelerated learning, or spaced repetition, contributing to accelerating learning, called Memo. And the idea of this was that it does very little good to simply learn something and then forget it in a few days' time or a month, that you need to review. And furthermore, that reviewing willy-nilly is very inefficient, as opposed to using a computer to review at the most optimal periods of time, and optimality being frequently at first and then reviewing much less frequently as time goes on. And then this Memo program providing the optimal periods of review with what you might call electronic flashcards. And so I spent the next 15 years assiduously using this program. I would say an average of 3 to 4 hours a day. Say maybe 10,000 hours, I think the statistics would show on the statistics page of this software program after 15 years, at which time, after 15 years, I ceased using it. So I used this program an average of 3 or 4 hours a day for 15 years, missing, I'd say, 1 day a month and 2 weeks off per year. Well, after that period of time, I had accumulated and still have in my memory banks, so to speak, 160,000 flashcards. With a certain level, statistics say, of maybe 90% recall. Well, I would question that, especially today, not using this program anymore, but at any rate, the upshot being that I don't have a degree on the wall to prove this. First of all, to prove that I spent that time that I say I spent, nor that this whole idea of spaced repetition has even any validity. It's never been, quote, tested with double-blind studies or in a test tube. And I don't have a Ph.D. or M.D. degree to show for it, nor a master's degree, stating that I have a degree in super memo knowledge, say. But I'm not trying to boast here about anything at all. And whatever I have done, in fact, in life or have not done, really was quite forced upon me if you consider that it was simply the best option given resources and constraints I had at the time. You might say it wasn't a choice, by the way, that I obtained any of this training in a college setting or used this spaced repetition program. So, but the upshot being that I think a great many people in life do not have credentials at all, but have gone through experiences or even classroom training or computer studies or, hey, let's even say watched a couple thousand YouTube videos but don't have a degree on the wall, saying they have a Ph.D. or M.D. degree for having studied and being tested for watching 2,000 YouTube videos. And, of course, we're not even asking the question of whether they took notes when they watched the videos and reviewed them and how much review. I'm reminded, too, of a friend I once had from Appalachia who spent some time brought up by his grandmother with perhaps a lot of time on his hands as a child. And he once told me he learned so much by watching and observing animals that by watching the behavioral habits of animals, he learned a lot about human beings. But I don't know that he graduated from high school, and of course he didn't get a degree from a bachelor's accredited college, and certainly not a master's degree or Ph.D. or medical degree. And I probably don't think he had even a high school degree hanging diploma-wise on the wall either. So, was he a trained expert at all in understanding behavior of animals or people by extension? You might say, too, that in fact he might have been considered a clodhopper or someone from the hills. At one time, maybe eligible to show up on Green Acres shows because he doesn't have a Ph.D. or medical degree, basically. But are we then to discount everything he does know by observation and what his grandmother taught him? Oh, say, are we also to discredit all the empathy training he received thus, all the moral instruction, all the knowledge he has from intuition? But of course this is not testable in double-blind studies or by observation or, say by a stopwatch that says he spent so many hours in classroom instruction, followed by question and answer testing, or fill in the blank, period. And then the question overall being who gets to decide. Maybe his training overall was superior, to that of college training, but who gets to decide and why is a good question too. We might all agree, in fact, that it's a gift of sorts to have been raised by a doting, wise, clever, shrewd, patient grandmother, with lots of love too, by the way. But many would say she's not qualified to teach a child because she doesn't have a Ph.D. or medical degree, let alone master's degree, or college degree, period. And how do you even quantify how much training this child got from this grandmother when there was no stopwatch used or basically no attendance taken of a quantifiable nature? In other words, how many classroom courses did this child take, even in being raised lovingly or with empathy? Or let's say if this child were given a swat on the backside in an appropriate manner, if we want to say, as training at the woodshed, which some would say is appropriate and some wouldn't. Is this recorded on a chart anywhere as to how well it was administered and who administered it? Now, my personal opinion being that the woodshed is not the best treatment tool, as corporal punishment isn't either, in my opinion, by far. But the point being that this wasn't quantified as training as per number of hours received and how many times. And so, did this child receive training or not? And how good was it? Now, I would say also that this empathy training or not, or moral training, is not only getting short shrift at the college level, but I'll give you a personal example. When I left the military, after having resigned my commission in protest for moral reasons, a year or two later, very consternated and struggling for a variety of reasons, I decided to approach this problem by obtaining psychoanalysis. And the analyst was a medical doctor on the staff of a medical school. And she had received her bachelor's degree from no small university, so to speak, but the University of California in Los Angeles. And very quickly, the topic of discussion was my moral code. And she said two things that were the topic, basically. First, she said that if I didn't learn how to lie, I was going to be a clerk the rest of my life. And you know what? She was right. A few years later, I was a clerk for an insurance company. But I wasn't a clerk for that reason, I now realize. It was because I wasn't very wise at all in discerning character. I'll go into this a bit in just a minute. And secondly, at one point, she exasperatingly said to me that I should do whatever I feel like in life, but just make sure not to get caught. So, I would say that this didn't seem to pan out in life for me as time went on. Her approach to morals. And I think that we could all agree that an honest handyman or honest plumber, honest provider at the sole practitioner level would be highly sought after, in fact. But this medical doctor's approach was that morals are totally useless, in fact. And she basically urged that I take a non-moral approach to life. You might say almost a approach, I'm not going to use a word, but a non-admirable approach. But the point being, too, that she never received any training of an appropriate nature in getting that medical degree in morals, moreover in empathy. And yet she considered herself the trained expert, and that others, by the way, were not trained. I would say, for instance, she would definitely say no minister is trained, or your grandmother, or your mother, or anyone, in fact, who didn't have a specific degree from a specific college in a specific area and in a specific way. And going back to, I would definitely say she had very little mathematical training too, to, shall we say, learn how to do well the sorting of the wheat from the chaff, or to be, as I would facetiously call it, a good BS detector. Well, you can't do that unless you are able to think quite well, and what makes you a better thinker than good mathematical training, I would say. Also, I would say an advantage of a helping professional in the emotional realm receiving depth therapy is that one of the adjuncts or hopes of depth therapy is to root out limiting beliefs. These probably were called at one time delusions, in fact. So you could have, for instance, a person at the Ph.D. or M.D. degree level today providing therapy, emotional help, shall we say, but who has never received any depth therapy and has a great many limiting beliefs that weren't rooted out because they didn't receive depth therapy. You can't root out limiting beliefs by just reading in a book that so-and-so says you have a limiting belief, for instance, and then just say, aha, I have this, and 2 seconds later it's gone. I would say no, the rooting out of such takes time and is very painful, perhaps. So, perhaps we have to question whether so-and-so is an expert in the emotional area if they haven't rooted out a great many limiting beliefs, and yet are offering, quote, therapy, or help in the emotional direction in general. Who, again, gets to say who's qualified? Is it simply the person who has the Ph.D. or M.D. degree? Was the training appropriate, in other words? If that training wasn't appropriate, and yet they have the degree, saying it was, did this degree come from a Diploma Mills school, is the upshot I'm asking. In other words, was that degree of much worth? There are a few, in fact, who would go to the extreme of saying that the degree isn't worth the paper it was written on. But that's kind of an offensive statement, but still, a few have brought that up. Now, this is to digress again, but as my final point, I would bring up that college training in general is not quite venerated for emphasizing review, shall we say, but instead, what college is about, in my opinion, is attending a number of classes and it having been recorded that you paid your tuition, and by the way, that you passed certain tests, and perhaps at the PhD level that you wrote a dissertation and that someone said it was vetted or okay. And on that basis you received your degree. But nobody And I mean nobody ever requires that you spent so and so many hours reviewing what you were taught or read or took notes on. There is no requirement ever put out by any degree and any accrediting institution ever, I can guarantee you, that says you cannot get the degree unless you spent so many clockable hours in reviewing any particular topic matter. So you simply are evaluated on having attended classes and received, quote, grades. There's no requirement for having reviewed it such that it's stuck for any length of time. Nor is there even any requirement in most colleges degree today that you even were awake in class, or that you didn't have earbuds in your ears, or that you weren't looking at your laptop or listening to music. As opposed, say, to my time at West Point, when if you fell asleep in your chair, you were required to stand up, under the idea that if you were standing up, there was no way you could be asleep in class. And therefore it was argued you would be ingesting the knowledge better. Furthermore, many of the classrooms were designed to have no windows, so that you wouldn't be distracted, and study the material better. And we might say then, basically, that, of course, it was beyond question that you were not allowed to look at a laptop or listen to music or in any way, shape, or form be less than 100% present mentally while being instructed from A to Z. And if you were more than 5 seconds or even 1 second late showing up to class, you received demerits. So then, of course, there being no question that you attended, quote, 100% of the lecture, not 50% in any way, shape, or form by coming late. In fact, some people receive degrees having attended few classes at all. Today, at modern universities, they simply show up to take the test, and the rest of the time are tutored by those who do attend the classes, giving them the gist of the matter. They just show up, then take the exam, and get the degree. And that's to the extreme then. And so, these are a number of points I bring up to illustrate what I think is a very profound question with many implications. I don't bring out this topic lightly, that simply because someone has a college degree, even a Ph.D. or M.D. degree, terminal degrees, shall we say, doesn't mean that this is better than some other forms of acquiring knowledge, first of all. Nor does it mean that if it was, quote, done in a scientific manner and test tube studied double-blind manner, then it's better than what our grandmother gave us, or Indian chief, or intuition, or minister, because those things simply weren't, quote, testable. They were, quote, wishy-washy feeling type things. So that's why I've entitled this, Did So-and-so receive a degree from a Diploma Mill college? Because what good is it to go to a college if you didn't acquire much at all? Maybe you acquired, in fact, some bad habits about a number of things that make you worse off for having attended, in fact. And that then why not call this diploma mill training? The point being, perhaps we ought to take a look at whether, quote, training in general was in fact training, good quality training. Maybe it was hurtful training. I bring up, finally, Georgia O'Keefe, the noted painter from the 20th century, some would say the finest female painter of the 20th century. And when asked at one point her opinion on why she became the greatest of painters at that era as a female, one of her responses was that it involved a great deal of unlearning, in fact. And that not only do we then have to question whether a degree in general is training in the positive direction, but whether maybe there's a lot that needs to be unlearned from that training, and how many people take the time and effort and pain to unlearn anything these days, especially if they went to college and it was supposedly the scoop, shall we say, the last word. If Georgia O'Keefe says the secret to her success was to unlearn so much when all the other people she went to school with didn't spend time unlearning, maybe this is a point to consider too. Again, I wish you well. This is not definitive. I didn't sit down for hours and hours writing a organized list here before talking about all this, but I hope some of the points resonate, whether the listener has a degree or no degree at all.